Hey there. In this video, I'm going to talk about CSS layout. I'm basically going to run through this kind of long tutorial. So if you prefer written tutorial, you can read that or maybe do a mix, completely up to you, really. But I'm going to kind of just run through this kind of verbally. And so before I get started, maybe I'll just talk about why. Why are we talking about this? So at this point in your web development journey, I'm assuming that you've seen HTML at least a little bit and at least a little bit of CSS. So you know how to add a class to an HTML element and give it a different color or something. And that's all good. And now you might be trying to take your design to the next level and position different elements kind of in relation to each other and make it look nice and make it look honestly like a real website, whatever that means for you. And it's hard, honestly. It's so for me one of the hardest parts of CSS. So you might have done a search for, I don't know, position elements in CSS or something. And you'll get a bunch of options. You'll get, okay, there's a position keyword, there's a position property. Maybe that's what I want. You might have done a search for CSS layout or something, and you'll get even more options. And you'll, read one tutorial and it'll tell you how to do it one way. And then you'll read a different tutorial and it'll tell you how to do it in a completely different way. And for me, that's really hard. It's really hard for me to kind of wrap my brain around because I just want to know how to do it. I don't want you to give me 5 different options. I want you to tell me how to do it, right? And so for a long time, that really confused me about CSS. What is the best way to do it? Do I use this position thing? Do I use something called float? Do I use something called Flexbox? What is this grid thing? And it kind of just all bounced around each other without really having any, real order in my brain, if that makes sense. Until I read this really amazing history of CSS, which I'll link down at the bottom. And, it kind of sounds like it would be boring. And, I don't want to tell you whether it's interesting or not to you, but to me, it really helped click things into place for me. It really helped me understand oh, that's why they say, for example, don't use tables. Why would anyone want to do that, right? Or this is why floats work a certain way compared to Flexbox. It's because one was kind of invented before the other. And so that really helped me understand how all of this stuff fits together. And so a lot of how I am going to contextualize it is through the lens of the history of CSS. So that's a lot of what the written tutorial here goes through, and it's a lot of what I'm going to mention. So that's a bit of context for why I explain it this way and why it fits into my brain this way. But I'm just going to kind of run through it in that style. Okay, I'll come back to divs, I think. So I'm not going to give a whole big history lesson because honestly, I don't know the whole history of HTML and CSS, and it's really complicated, and you don't really need to know the full history. If you're interested in that, you can do a search and read all about it to your heart's content. But I'm going to keep it kind of broad. So HTML was released around 1993-ish, depending on how you measure. We'll call it the early 90s. And during this dark time, they didn't have CSS. HTML was so new that CSS did not exist. It was only HTML. And so the way that you would position elements was through the table tag, the table HTML tag. And so here's an example of what that might look like. You have your table tag, and then you have, table cells inside of that table tag, and you can do things like create a left nav and a main content area. It's kind of a common pattern. You might imagine that you have another cell up at the top that's a top nav maybe, and maybe another cell at the bottom that's a footer or something. But, this demonstrates the kind of the fundamentals. And again, notice that there's no CSS here. It's all just pure HTML. And while I'm here, maybe real quick, I'll just mention how this code editor works. If you've not seen this kind of, widget before. So this is something called CodePen, and it's like an external editor that you can click like up here to go to like a full editor, and you have your HTML down here and your preview window down here, and it's just a nice way to like really quickly modify or play with different like code snippets without needing to worry about files and stuff. So I use CodePen a lot for like smaller examples, and you can feel free to use CodePen as well. If you are working from like your own HTML file in like a Scratch directory or something, that's totally cool. What I would do is like copy the code from here and put it into the body tag of your HTML. So I have that somewhere. So here's just a Scratch HTML file, and right now it has just hello world, a p tag in there, and I have it open in my browser. This is like a common workflow as well. So what you can do is copy it from the CodePen and just paste it into here, and you can play with the alignment and whatnot. I'm not going to worry too much about it right now, but you can save it and then refresh, and there you have your result. So whether you're using a Scratch file or CodePen, it's all good. It's all just HTML and CSS and stuff. So it doesn't really matter how you are saving your files and viewing it in the browser. So both should work. Just wanted to mention that in case you've not seen this particular editor before. Okay, so we are currently in the early 90s, right? And we are building websites with tables, and that's great because we don't have any other choice. And time goes on, and now it's around 1996 or so, and CSS is released around like the mid 90s, right around 1996, but it's kind of a subset of what we have today. And so there's no way to position elements in the first version of CSS. It is all about like colors and like styling the font. Like, is it bold or is it underlined or, that kind of thing. There's no layout in CSS1. And so at that point, you're still doing all of your layouts in table form. And that's just how it was done. Then let's see. So HTML was, a new version of HTML was released in 1997, and it included a new tag called div. And so I'm going to just briefly mention what a div is in case you haven't seen it. Like if you're new to HTML, then you've probably seen tags like the p tag or the h1 tag or, the a tag or the image tag, things like that, that specify a particular kind of content. Div is a little different. Div represents a division. I had to look that up. I didn't actually know. And it lets you basically segment your page into sections. So generally like rectangular sections. And so here's a code snippet that contains a div, gives it a class with yellow, and the CSS is, relatively, I don't like the word simple, but like the yellow class has a background color of yellow. It's hopefully what you would kind of expect. So this div is kind of the outermost div, and maybe let me view this on CodePen so I have a little bit more room. The outermost div is the yellow div, and it contains other stuff, which is what a div does generally. So it contains a p tag up here. I'm in the yellow div, that guy. It also contains another div, which contains just some content. Here's the red div, and then it contains a third div that has its own class and contains HTML, and you can kind of nest and have like HTML tags inside HTML tags inside HTML tags, all the way down. But here's, just an example of how divs are used. And the CSS just adds like some spacing to the div and a border, and then some background colors just to make them a little bit more obvious. So this is a div. This is a very common HTML tag in layouts, so I wanted to call it out specifically. And they were kind of added to HTML a few years after the first version of HTML, in around the mid 90s, 97 or so. Okay, so then we're kind of in the late 90s now. We're around 1998, and CSS2 was released, and we're all very excited because this now has layout included in it. So specifically, it has two things. I'm kind of painting a broad brush here, but has two things that I'm going to talk about. It has floats and it has inline blocks. And so the way these work, let's look at this example. I have my HTML here. I think that's kind of it. I have two divs. One is this kind of sidebar, which contains some sidebar content. The content is not super important, but it's, you know, a p tag and a list tag. And then another div that contains some content. And maybe just to demonstrate what this would do like without floats, maybe I'll take away those classes. And without any floats, this is what divs are going to do. They're just going to stack on top of each other, and that's probably not what you want. Maybe it is, and that's cool. But you know, generally folks wanted to kind of align content like next to each other, or position content next to each other. So you want like a left nav and maybe a main content, and maybe a right nav and like a footer down at the bottom, and like maybe inside the footer there's different things like next to each other. But HTML will generally put stuff just kind of on top of each other, and a lot of the layout tools are all about how do I get it from being on top of each other to being next to each other. That sounds like a dumb problem, but it's actually really hard for reasons that we'll get into. So anyway, this is what divs would look like without floats. So now let me float my content. Really all I'm doing is changing the class back to the ones I already had. And CodePen doesn't always automatically update. It's annoying, so just refresh. Fine. All right, so now I'm back to having two divs, and they have the sidebar class and the content class. This styling just gives both divs the same kind of border and padding. And now the sidebar, here's where the magic starts to happen. Here's this float property, which takes, you know, left or right, basically. I'm not sure if there are other options. Usually you'll see left and right. That says, hey, sidebar should go to the left of anything else. So there it is. And then content has a margin left of 100 pixels. And this is maybe weird, but that's because this artifact of how float works. Float generally doesn't have any size. The browser pretends like it doesn't have any size, and it just kind of moves it to the left and then keeps everything else in the same position. So to demonstrate what that looks like, I'll just change this to 0, which is the default. And so you'll see that like my content, if I don't give it a left margin, it's kind of like, it kind of overlaps the sidebar, and that's, you know, again, probably not what we wanted. And so you have to do these kind of tricks with floats where you position stuff with margins, and it's generally annoying, but it works, right? And you know, in the late 90s, this was one of the only options. Okay, so that's floats in a nutshell. The other thing that CSS2 contained was blocks, and so I'll just open up this example, kind of walk through it. So same exact HTML. I have two divs, one's a sidebar and one's the main content. And now the way it works is that both divs have the display property set to inline block, which is telling the browser, instead of treating them as blocks, which are those things that go on top of each other, treat them as inline blocks, which are kind of next to each other. And, you know, this works. There are other downsides. So like you saw with float, you had to like play with margins and stuff. So that was kind of the downside of floats. With inline blocks, it gets weird if you have like longer content. And let's just see. So I'm going to just paste a bunch of content in here just for demonstration purposes. Yeah. And close my tag and fine. Okay, so like this works, but now what I'm going to do is make my window smaller. So where am I? Let me move this around a little bit, and I'm going to just kind of make my window a little bit less wide. And kind of notice what the div will do. So the div like kind of wraps. So HTML will wrap the content if there's not enough room for it. And again, this is probably not what you want to happen. This is probably not what you want to happen. So you'd have to do weird things with, you know, other CSS rules to prevent this from happening, and it just kind of gets really annoying and really hard to make sure that your content looks okay on various screen sizes. So that's inline blocks in a nutshell, right? So I'm mentioning floats and inline blocks because they are still used in CSS layouts. They're kind of older, but you'll still see them all the time in tutorials and example code and like in real code bases. So yeah, I wanted to mention them in the historical context because they are still around and folks still use them. So you will see them in real code if you look for it on the internet. So that's kind of what floats and blocks are. And now we are sort of caught up to the modern day. So it gets really complicated, honestly. I tried to figure out like a straightforward story, a way to explain like, and then this happened. But after like the late 90s, CSS just goes wild. Because the way that it worked is like CSS is not one thing. CSS is now like 20 different things. And they each have their own history, and it's just really complicated. But long story short, CSS3 was built on top of CSS2, which is the thing that we were just talking about from the late 90s. And again, depending on how you measure, Flexbox is a feature that was added to CSS3 around 2017 or so like the mid 2010s. It's all very complicated, but you can look into the history of CSS if you're super curious, but just generally around the mid 2010s is when Flexbox was added. Okay. So we've seen some older ways to position elements, and we've seen tables, and we've seen floats, and we've seen blocks. And we've seen the downsides of those. So tables are just kind of hard to maintain and they're bad for screen readers. Floats, you'd have to like position things really carefully to make sure that there's not overlap. And that gets really annoying when your content changes, which happens all the time. And then blocks, you have that weird wrapping thing. So you'd have to play with other rules to make sure that the wrapping didn't mess up your content too badly. So these are the kinds of issues that Flexbox is meant to address. And so the way Flexbox works is you have a div. Let me just look at the HTML. I think it's just the same as it was before, except now there's this extra container div that contains the other divs. I guess the name is hopefully self-explanatory, but you have one outermost div that contains two other divs. That's the gist of it. So if I go to the CSS, the container div has display flex. And that's kind of what sets it all off. That says, hey, this is now, this div is now using the flex layout. So apply rules from the flex layout to this div. And so you'll notice that like the sidebar and the content div, they are next to each other, even though they're divs. So they should show up on top of each other. But because of flex, the rules are different. And so you get this nice left and right alignment, and you don't have any of the overlapping or anything like that. It kind of just works kind of automagically right out of the box. So that's the the very first entry point to Flex is this display Flex. If you see this, then you're in kind of Flex land. You're using you're in a container that uses Flex to lay out its children. From there, what you do is you set various CSS properties on both the container div and on the children, the child divs, the child elements, whatever. The parent and the children. You set Flex properties on both of them to customize various things. I'm probably not going to run through every single one of these just because this video is going to end up being very long already, and you can probably you can read about the exact properties, but maybe just to walk through the idea of Flex properties, what I'll do is run through a couple of them. So we already talked about display Flex. Display Flex just kind of kicks it all off. Display Flex says, hey, this container it should use the Flex layout rules instead of the default HTML rules, which are just putting things on top of each other. And so here's an example. Here's a container that contains 3 divs. And again, by default, this would show them on top of each other. But because it's Flex, they're right next to each other. So that's kind of the bare minimum of a Flex layout is display Flex, and then it'll show them kind of in one row. You can change that, of course. So instead of showing things in a row, you can say, hey, I actually want flex to display them in a column, which gets closer to the default behavior. But you can then further customize it. But you can switch between row and column. It's totally fine. Some other things. Yeah, okay. So I said that Flex will display things in a single row. And that's true by default. But if you want to change that behavior, you can actually say, hey, I actually want you to wrap, which gets kind of closer to the inline block behavior. But you can, further customize it using other Flex properties. So here's an example of a container that has first display Flex, which says, hey, use Flexbox rules in this container. And then also one of those Flexbox rules is flex wrap. So that says when I get more content than I have room for, then wrap it to the next line. Yeah, okay. Here's I don't know how many more of these I'm going to go through. Maybe I'll just do a couple more and then kind of just point out how to learn more, which I think is more important than trying to memorize anything. So let me maybe pop this out into its own thing. And what I have is a Flexbox container. And what I'm going to do is maybe take away this justify content just to talk about it. So by default, what's going to happen is what we saw earlier, where it's going to lay out the components kind of next to each other. I have 1, 2, 3, just kind of in one row. If I want to add spacing between those elements, I can use the justify content rule or CSS property. And it takes a few different options. And again, CSS or CodePen is not automatically updating, so it's annoying, but refresh. Okay, so here's justify content. Here's space around, which kind of adds space around the elements. Again, the name is maybe self-explanatory. So you'll see that there's space to the left and to the right of each of these elements. And there are other options. So let me see. So let's just look at maybe, I don't know, center. So now they're kind of pushed to the middle. They're still in a row with no space in them, but now they're squeezed to the center. And you can maybe get a sense of how you might use this in your layout. So I don't know, if you're designing your page and you're thinking about your header, like this thing way at the top, and you want to position the links in your header. Do you want them to show up kind of in the center? Do you want them to show up to the left? Do you want them to show up kind of with space between them? It's up to you. And Flexbox makes it easy to just kind of set those rules and let the browser handle the rest. You don't have to worry about margins or overlap or anything wrapping unless you want it to. You can just kind of set the rules and the browser will do the right thing. So that's justify content. And maybe I'll jump down to, so far what we've done is we have looked at different properties that you can set on the Flexbox container itself. So those properties are telling the container how to position the children. So we've seen it like all the way to the left, spread out, in a row, in a column, that kind of thing. And there are other properties, and you can read through and learn more about them. And I'll maybe point to some other resources at the bottom. But the idea is the same. You set different properties on the parent container to customize how the children are laid out. So now let me jump down to some other properties that you don't set on the parent. You actually set them on the child, or on the children, the child elements. I don't know what the plural of that is. So here's one example where, okay, I've got my handy 3 elements, which are pretty much the same as what we had before. The HTML is not super different. It's just 3 divs inside of a container, and I've got my display flex. And now, so by default, what will happen is the child elements will just kind of be the size of their content. We saw that before, where they were just kind of sized based on how many letters were in the content. But you can change that. So you can basically say, hey, child element, I want you to grow to fill up any empty space that's in the parent. And so this is a little bit different from what we saw before. Before we were saying, hey, container, hey, parent element, here's some rules about positioning your children. And now it's kind of going the other way, where we're saying, hey, child element, here's a rule about how you position yourself in the parent. So specifically, this one is Flex Grow. It's kind of a common one, and you can set it to, it's kind of wonky, honestly. You set it to a number, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, number like that, and the number that you give it tells it how much to grow compared to the other children. I know that's confusing, so maybe just kind of look at this example. We have this red div, which has no flex grow when the default is 0, so it's not going to grow at all. So that's why like the width of this element is right up against the content that it contains. Then we say, hey, blue div, you have a flex grow of 1, which like by itself doesn't really mean much until you look at, hey, green div, you have a flex grow of 2. So notice that the blue div kind of grows a little bit, and the green div grows quite a bit more. It's around twice as much, actually, because these are kind of relative to each other. So flex grow of 2 will make you grow roughly twice as much as flex grow of 1, and flex grow of 0 is don't grow at all. So that's one flex property that you can set on a child element to tell it how to position itself in the parent. So similarly, let me maybe pop this out into its own thing. You have flex shrink, which is basically the inverse of flex grow. And so I have my handy 3 divs, or actually 4 divs here. We've added a yellow one just to make it fun. And they have various flex shrink properties. So now the red div has flex shrink of 0. So notice that it does not shrink at all. It's full size right to the edges of the content. Then flex shrink of 1, 2, and 3, they kind of shrink more and more. And the whole point of all of this is to make it easier to make sure that your content works on various screen sizes. Maybe I should have mentioned that at the very top, but a very common issue in HTML is, okay, it looks fine on my computer if I have these specific rules, specific margins and stuff, but now someone else is looking at it on their computer, and now it looks weird because their screen is smaller or wider or something else. And this gets a lot worse when people look at the internet on their phones, which is a more modern problem, but this problem has persisted since the very early days of HTML. And so what these properties like flex grow and flex shrink get you is I've told my elements here how to size themselves, and no matter what the size of the screen is, they'll apply those rules, and it'll look pretty reasonable just without much other customization. So with this setup here, this red div will always be bigger than this yellow div, just based on the flex shrink property. Okay, so that's flex shrink, and I think there's one more that I'll mention. So we have talked about like making the content grow, making the child elements grow, and we talked about making them shrink. So that's on wider or skinnier screen sizes, and that's all good. But you might want to just set a width, and a couple ways to do that, but the one I want to call out is the flex basis property. So that's another CSS property that you set on your child, and it takes a size, a couple different ways to define sizes, but here I've just used pixels. So this one's 300 pixels, this one's 175 and 25. So this is kind of the size that the elements start at before it does any shrinking or growing. So you can kind of customize the the sizes of your elements by default. Okay. I'm not sure if any of that made sense, or like why it's I'm not sure if it's obvious why that's useful. So here's maybe the payoff of it. Those three properties, flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, they are so widely used in Flexbox that there's a sort of shortcut to using them, and it's just called flex. And so flex is another property, CSS property, that is all three of those things combined. So let's say you have flex grow of 1, flex shrink of 2, and flex basis of 300 pixels. You can shorten those three lines into one line, which is just flex 1 to 300 pixels. So it's the flex grow, then a space, then the flex shrink, then a space, then the flex basis. And why that's useful, let me edit this in its full window. So I've defined all three properties here on all three divs. So my red div has a flex grow of 0, so it won't grow at all. A flex shrink of 2, so it'll actually shrink quite a bit, and then a basis of 300, so it starts out kind of wider. Blue is flex grow of 1, flex shrink of 1, and then 125, so it'll grow, a little bit, shrink a little bit. And then green has a flex grow of 2, so it'll grow a lot, flex shrink of 0, so it'll never shrink, and then a flex basis of 75, so it starts out at 75. And now here's the payoff. I'm going to resize this div. I've kind of added a couple of properties to make this div resizable. That's what this stuff is doing. But kind of watch what happens to the divs as I resize the outermost div. And you can think of this as what happens when someone else views it on their computer or on their phone or whatever, or if they resize their window. So I'm going to resize this, make it a little wider. And so notice that the red div is not growing at all. And that's because that flex grow of 0 is saying, hey, never grow this. So you might use that for something like a left nav or something where you always just want it to be particular size and never have it grow at all. The blue div is growing, medium. It's growing, but it's not growing as fast as the green div. The green div is growing about twice as much because its flex grow is 2, and the blue div's flex grow is 1. Okay, so that's kind of the flex grow part of it. And now if I make it smaller again, the flex shrink property. So flex shrink, I'm going to shrink. And we're going to go kind of back to the beginning. So notice that once I reach, let me go back to how it started. Once I reach the basis widths, maybe just refresh actually. So here's what it starts at. So now let me shrink it and notice that the red div is going to shrink the most because its flex shrink is 2. And then the blue one is shrinking, but you can see it if you stare, but it's not nearly as noticeable as the red div because it has a flex shrink of 1 compared to the red div's flex shrink of 2. And then the green div is not going to shrink at all because of its flex shrink of 0. And so you can see that because of these three properties, I have defined quite complex behavior in one line of code, or 3 if you count each div. And this would be really hard in floats or in blocks or tables. Oh my god. And this is the payoff of Flexbox. You have this nice smooth behavior that will work kind of magically, kind of without you thinking too hard about it. Once you think hard about these three numbers, you don't have to worry too much about exactly what it's going to look like on an iPhone or on a tablet or on a widescreen monitor, because these rules are going to apply kind of everywhere. Okay, so that's Flex. I think that might be where I leave it. I'll say that my goal here is not to explain every single thing you can do in Flex. I think I've said this before, but I don't recommend trying to memorize everything. I recommend understanding the fundamentals, which are you have a parent div, which you set display flex on, and then you have a child div, which you optionally set other properties on. And then you use these various properties on both the parent and on the children to customize the behavior of the Flex layout. So the fundamentals, and that's honestly, that's all I would say that you should memorize. And now From there, the question is, what Flex properties do I have available to me? So you can look at this page itself for a few examples, but there's a really nice one that, here. So CSS Tricks is a really cool website that has a bunch of like CSS and actually other tutorials, but I really like its CSS content. This page is really helpful for understanding the various properties you can set. So here are the properties that you can set on the parent. Here are properties that you can set on the children, and it has these like nice, like, I don't know, these infographics or whatever that let you see kind of at a glance how they work. So like Flex Grow, here's what Flex Grow does. It makes stuff grow. That might be easier to think about at a glance if you have that image, like that example. So Flex Wrap stuff. Justify content. I thought this particular one was especially beautiful because like usually I play with it in like the developer tools to figure out exactly what each one does because I never remember, but here it is, like here's what each one does. And you can read through this to get more info and play around with the different options and think about what your goal is in your design. Maybe describe it out loud. Say, I have a header div and I want the links in my header to be spaced out evenly, but I want the left one to be right up against the left. Something like that, whatever your actual goal is. And then kind of look through here and see, like, do any of these images kind of match my description, and play with it and try to get something working. That's honestly how I think most CSS developers operate. I don't think that most people have all of these things memorized and just kind of output it from their brain. I think there's a lot of looking through things like this guide to remind ourselves of exactly how stuff works, and then playing around and seeing how our expectations match reality. Okay, so that is, I think, as far as I'm going to go on Flexbox. You've learned the fundamentals, and you've seen one example of how to find more information. You can also, just do a search of like CSS Flex. Let's say we wanted to, I don't know, what's an example of something you would want to do in Flex? Like, I don't know, align by elements to the right. You can do a search like this, and there you go. You've got options. So this is MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. I'm embarrassed that in one of my previous videos I forgot what that stood for. Whatever, guys. It's really hard to talk and think at the same time. Anyway, you can read through this kind of resource to understand more about how you might accomplish your particular goal. So that's kind of the takeaway that I want you to walk away with. It's not like, now I know every single Flexbox property, because I don't know, no one does. And more importantly, what you know is, here's how Flexbox works. You set properties on the parent and the child, and now you know how to find those properties by either searching or looking at documentation like this page and CSS Tricks, stuff like that. Okay, cool. So that's Flexbox. And now we are in the, I don't know, mid 2010s, right? And again, that historic context. And Flexbox was honestly like really exciting for everyone because we no longer had to deal with floats, and we no longer had to deal with like inline divs, like wrapping and fighting with us based on the screen size. And it honestly solved a lot of problems. However, Flexbox is pretty specifically designed for a row of content or a column of content, depending on your Flex base. See, I don't know the properties ahead of time. Depending on your Flex direction, right? So it's either a row of content or a column of content, depending on Flex direction. And we may do with that solves a lot of problems. You can do a lot with that, especially if you get into the idea of like wrapping or nesting layouts. So maybe you have an outermost div with a column Flexbox layout, and inside of that column there are other divs that have row Flexboxes. So you can lay your whole page out using Flexbox. But Flexbox wasn't actually really designed for, you know, both dimensions. You can wrap content, but you don't have a lot of control over how the, you know, the relationship between wrapped content items are. I don't think that was proper English, but you don't have a lot of control over how the items are wrapped and how they are positioned relative to each other and stuff. You have some control, but it's not what it was designed for. So here comes the new kid on the block, which is grid layout. And grid layout is very similar to Flexbox in a lot of ways. Kind of the fundamentals are the same, but it is designed for two-dimensional content, so a grid of content. To put it in the historical context, it's actually not officially released. CSS is super weird. It's like something that people are talking about, but not something that's part of the official CSS spec. However, it's so popular that most browsers have implemented it, and it'll work in most modern browsers. I think it's something like 95% or something. Anyway, so grid is, like I said, kind of similar to Flexbox in that you have a container div and then you have child divs, and you set on the container div display : grid instead of display : flex, and that tells the container div you shouldn't use the default HTML rules for laying out content, which again is like putting stuff just kind of on top of each other. You should use this fancy new grid layout. And then you set properties on both that container and on the children to customize how that grid works. So here's the handy dandy left sidebar example. The HTML is very similar. I have a container and then a sidebar and then a content div. There they are. And the container div contains a property, which is display grid, and then some other properties that we'll talk about in a second. But the result is this layout, which again, you don't have to worry about things like wrapping or the weird overlapping thing with floats. It just kind of works, and it will work on most screen sizes, or hopefully every screen size actually. So okay, that's grid. That's an example of grid. Let's talk about some of the properties now. So display grid is the entry point, you can think of it. If you see this, then you know that container is using grid layout, and you can look for various properties that customize the grid behavior. So by default, it's actually not super interesting because the default behavior is very similar to the default behavior of just HTML. It's just going to lay things out kind of on top of each other. They'll take up the whole width though. So let's talk about maybe customizing the grid and making it a little more interesting. So maybe I'll pop this out into its own thing. So here we go. We have our container, which contains the same three divs that most of the other examples have contained. I have a red one, a blue one, and a green one. Nothing too complex going on over there. Now I get over to the CSS and I say, hey, container, use display of grid, which says use grid rules to lay out your content. And now I set this property, which is grid template columns, and I give it, in this case, 3 values. I say 100 pixels, 1 FR, 2 FR, stands for fraction, I think. What this is doing is it's telling your grid to create 3 columns. You're saying, hey grid, you're a grid that contains 3 columns, and those 3 columns have these rules for sizing themselves. So the first one is 100 pixels, and the second one is 1 fraction of the remaining space. I'll talk about that in a second. And the third one is 2 fractions. So the way I think about it, this might be oversimplifying it, but it's whatever, it works. It's how I think about it in my brain. This is very similar to like the flex grow property, where flex grow, you give it a number like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and those numbers are kind of relative to each other. They added the FR, I think, just to be more explicit. I'm not sure. But the idea is the same. 1 FR versus 2 FR. The 2 FR will be about twice as big as the 1 FR. But they'll both kind of take up whatever space is left over after any other specific columns. So this rule is saying spend 100 pixels on the leftmost column, and then of the remaining space, make the blue one, I don't know, about half as big as the third one. So you have this kind of relationship between them that, again, will work on any screen size. And so as you resize your window, that kind of fraction will stay true without you having to worry about like exactly how many pixels it is. Okay, so that's our grid that currently contains 3 columns, but just 1 row. But that's not a grid yet, right? So we can go to the next level, go to the next dimension, I guess it would be. And the HTML, it contains a few more divs just to kind of demonstrate the, how it works. But the CSS, there's really one big change that we care about. So again, the container is display grid. We have, in this case, 2 columns, where the left column will be 1 fraction, the right column will be 2 fractions. So it's like the left column will be about half as big as the right column. That's what these are saying. And then this is what makes it a grid. We say, okay, you have 2 columns and you have 3 rows. Where the rows, it's a very similar kind of syntax. It's a space separated list of sizes that can be pixels, can be fractions, can be other stuff. But what this creates is a grid that is 2 columns wide by 3 rows tall. And so that's how you get this this behavior of the content being laid out in this grid and like at these sizes. So my first row is 100 pixels, right? And my second row is 50 pixels. And my third row is 100 pixels. You can change this. So like, let's say, I don't know, let's change this to like 1 FR, see what happens. And okay, it's pretty small because the remaining space, there's not, I guess there's just not much remaining space. I don't know. Let's just make this 2FR, see what happens. Yeah, okay, so that's what I would expect. So the way I would read this personally is I would start by looking at the kind of specific values. I would say, okay, the second row is going to take up exactly 50 pixels. Okay, cool, good. And then of the remaining space, the first row is going to take up about one fraction of that compared to the third row, which is going to be about twice as big. We can maybe set the height specifically. I'm kind of just messing around now, but maybe I'll make this, I don't know, 400, maybe 300. Maybe I'll move my thing. There you go. So maybe this is a better example where, because I know the height ahead of time, I can look at the columns and rows, specifically the rows actually, and I can say, all right, this middle row is going to be 50 pixels, and then of that remaining space, which in this case is, is 300 pixels. Oh my God. Of the remaining 300 pixels, the first row will take up one fraction of that compared to the third row, which will take up 2 fractions of that. So third row is going to be about twice as big. All right, let me undo all of that so it doesn't mess up my examples. Oops. Okay, so that's making it into a grid, right? You have your elements laid out in a grid, and as an exercise, maybe what we'll do is like change our grid to say, I don't know, maybe it has actually 3 columns and only 2 rows. And okay, that's unfortunate color coincidence, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I have 3 columns and 2 rows, and I didn't have to worry about my HTML. I didn't have to set any, I didn't have to worry too much about exactly how many pixels to lay my stuff out in. I just said, you know what, instead of having 2 columns and 3 rows, I'm going to switch that up, say 3 columns and 2 rows, and it just kind of works. And that's the payoff of the grid layout. You set your grid properties to size and position your cells in your grid, and it just works. compared to stuff like floats and inline blocks. This is way easier to do stuff like position your elements in a layout. Anyway, all right, I'm getting kind of rambly. Okay, so like I said, grid is very similar to Flexbox in that once you set display grid, the next step is to set various properties on both the parent and child. And so I think I just have a couple examples of that because the idea is, again, very similar. But you are actually not tied to the grid, like the cells specifically. And by that, I mean you can like stretch the elements to take up more than one column. And the way you do that, so first of all, let's just look at the container div and we say display grid and we see that we have 2 columns and 3 rows. Okay, I think this is just the exact same thing that we saw before. But then we get into the child elements and you'll see this like grid column start and grid column end. These properties, these are grid properties that customize the behavior of a child. And so you can see that the grid column start is 1, which is just kind of over here, and grid column end is 3. Now this is a little confusing because what it's saying is start at 1 and end at 3. It doesn't go through 3. In fact, we don't have a third column. It's saying like end at 3. So in other words, this red div, this red child div, will take up 2 columns, 1 and 2. So that's why it stretches. I'll maybe just take this out for a second to compare the behavior. So yeah, my green div is still doing its thing, but now my red div just takes up 1 cell in the grid by default, and I can change that by adding the grid column start and grid column end properties. And again, CodePen is not auto-updating. That's annoying. Whatever, refresh. Okay, there we go. The red div is now stretched from 1, ending at 3. So grid column start, grid column end. Same kind of idea with the green div, but kind of doing rows instead. So I'm saying start at row 2 and end at row 4. So this is again 2 rows because 4 is not actually included. The end one is where you end, not like what you include. I always have to think about that one. But you can see like here's what would happen if you said 2 and 3. It's actually just 1 because you say start at 2 and end at 3, not including 3. So you have to say end at 4 if you want to take up 2. Okay, so my green div here is taking up 2 rows. And you can mix and match these. You can have a element that takes up multiple columns and multiple rows, but these are just 2 examples of spanning multiple cells. The other thing I want to point out is, so check out the HTML here, and specifically notice that like the order of the HTML. So my red div is first, then my blue div, and then my green div. So my green div is actually third in the HTML, but if you look at the page, it's actually second. And that is because by default, grid layout will position your child elements in the order that you have specified them in the HTML, but you can use these row start and row end and column start and column end properties to move stuff around in the grid. So when I say, hey, green, you start on row 2, that actually moves stuff around. So the blue div would have started on the second row, would have started here, and then 3 would have been over here. But since we move the green one over to 2, the blue one kind of automatically positions itself to the right. And this is helpful, particularly in things like SEO. I generally don't care about SEO and I generally get annoyed by it, honestly. But you can imagine that like maybe you have like a left nav that's like really long. It has a lot of content. Actually, I straight up do have one of those over on this website where this HTML is actually pretty complicated and it has a bunch of like things you can click into and all that stuff. And it actually shows up in the HTML first in my case. But a common thing in SEO is to make sure that the core content shows up before anything like that, because I don't know, things like Google and whatever other search engines you use, when they crawl the web, it matters, I guess, or it makes a difference anyway. And so what you can do is you can use these kind of properties to make sure that in your HTML, the left nav is actually at the bottom, but you use CSS to move it to the top. And that way you get kind of the best of both worlds. Your HTML makes the computers happy, and your CSS makes your human users happy. Anyway, that's kind of a random aside. The gist of this section of this video is you can use column start, column end, and row start and row end to kind of span multiple cells in your grid. So that's a property that you use on the child elements. Okay, I think we're just going to talk about one more thing. Yeah, and that is named cells. And I specifically wanted to call this out because honestly, it confuses me. The syntax kind of bothers me. What we saw in the previous example was we used the grid column start and grid column end and grid row start and grid row end properties, which take numbers to position the elements inside of the grid. And that works, but like we saw, it's kind of confusing in that like 2 to 4 actually means 2 and 3. And, I don't know, maybe you just don't think in terms of like grid lines and cell numbers and all that stuff. So there's this kind of weird syntax that lets you name particular parts of your grid. So I'm just going to jump to an example of that. So the HTML is the same. I just have the 4 divs inside of the container div. And so I look at my container div and I see display grid. So I say to myself, okay, that means that this container will use the grid layout rules instead of the default. Cool. And now I get to grid template columns, which is the same thing we saw before, which is a space separated list of numbers, which specifies the number of columns. But notice this like wonky like square bracket, then like I don't know, a name, and this the same thing over here. It's not actually defining columns. We still have 2 columns, and so it's basically ignored by the layout itself. Okay, that's weird. Grid template rows, same kind of thing, where you have your space separated list of lengths, or in this case heights, but you have these weird like square brackets with names in them. And again, that's ignored by the layout itself. We still have 3 rows, 1, 2, 3, 100, 50, and 100. So like, what is going on here? Honestly, it took me a minute to figure this stuff out. So that's why I'm mentioning it specifically, because if you see this kind of syntax on the internet, I don't want it to catch you off guard. So maybe what I'll do is let's look at the other example and then kind of compare and contrast. So here's our old example with just using numbers. So here's what grid template columns looked like and grid template rows. And specifically notice this red, we're going from column 1 to column 3. And that's why you get 1 and 2. Okay, so now let's jump over here and now sort of, compare the both what you see up here and what you see down here. So now, instead of just 1 and 2, I have this left and right, okay, and blah, blah, blah. We just looked at that. And now down here, here's kind of the payoff of this feature. In my red divs grid properties, I can now use these names. So I don't have to think in terms of numbers anymore. I can say, hey, red, you should start at the left and you should end at the right. And maybe that makes a little bit more sense than thinking in terms of like start at 1 and end at 3, but don't include 3. Same idea for the grid template rows, where I have middle and bottom. So middle is between the sort of first row and the second row. So the first row is here, second row is here. So the middle is right here. And if I go down to green, I can say, hey, green, start at that middle line and end at the bottom, which is, just after the last row. Okay, so that's named cells or named lines, I guess. Again, just a different kind of wonky syntax that threw me off, so I wanted to call it out specifically. If you see something in brackets in grid layout, it's probably a name of some kind that will then be used by a child element somewhere. All right, let's close some of this out. I think that's about as far as I want to go on grid, because like I said, I could sit here and explain every single grid property, but you're probably already bored and it won't be useful, because that's knowing them all is not how it works. The way it works, or the way I encourage you to think about it anyway, is the fundamentals of grid layout. The way it works is you set display grid on a parent, and then you set various grid properties on both the parent and the child. So the fundamentals. You now understand everything you need to know about grid. So now the only question is, what properties can I set? And I laid out a few of them, mostly just to get you into the habit of thinking about different properties, more the concept of setting properties. So now to find out what kinds of properties there are, same idea as what we talked about in Flexbox. So there are many, many, many examples on the internet. Here are a few that I particularly like. So again, CSS Tricks is great. Here's a very similar kind of infographic style tutorial that has images and stuff that walks through all of the different things you can do with both the parent and the child. Oh my God, so long. So here's the properties of the parent. Here's properties that you can set on the children. And I like that style of thinking about it. Again, W3 Schools, another really great resource where I would recommend just reading through this and thinking about how whatever design you have in your brain kind of maps to these concepts. So, if you want to show your elements in a grid but have different spaces between the columns and the rows, here's how you might do that. And exactly what properties you use depends on exactly what your goal is. So that's why I think it's not super important to memorize exact properties, because your goal will likely change and you'll need different properties next time. So here's an example of overlapping cells. Maybe that would be useful for your design. But I would just recommend reading through those. And again, search engines are your friend, and don't be afraid to try stuff out. And ask questions when you get stuck, of course. But the sort of meta lesson that I'm going to keep saying, I know you're probably sick of hearing it, is don't bother memorizing anything. You've memorized everything you need to know if you know that Flexbox and Grid work by setting properties on the parent and the child. That's all you need to know. Then you can find more specific properties based on your searching and researching and trying stuff out. Okay. I am getting sick of talking. It's been too long. So I'm going to try to maybe not get into the weeds so much. I wanted to walk through the properties of display or flex and grid, but really we talked about the important stuff. So now I'm just going to talk about a few other things that you might think about when you are laying out your elements in your page. So first off, this is just an example of how you might implement the most popular layout in both Flexbox and Grid. So if that's helpful, check it out, take it and remix it and change it to, reflect whatever styles and widths and heights and whatnot that you want. But here's the kind of bare bones example of how to use these tools to lay out your elements in this super popular layout. Okay. I will also mention that if it's not clear why Flexbox and Grid are so cool, here's a challenge to you. Do this, create this layout using only floats, using only float left and float right. Go ahead, try it. I dare you. It's possible. You can do it. People have done it probably millions of times, but it's really annoying. And same thing for inline blocks. Try doing this layout, recreating this layout with inline blocks. I dare you. Again, it's doable, but I think you'll run into a lot of problems that will make it a little more obvious why Flexbox and Grid are so exciting to us web developers. Okay, we're down to, I don't know, the last couple things. So the one thing I want to mention is I talked about a few layouts. We talked about tables, we talked about inline blocks, we talked about floats, we talked about Flexbox, we talked about Grid. And right now you might be thinking like, okay, what I need to do is choose one and that's what I'll use. But that's actually not quite true. It's a little more complicated than that, because what will most likely be the case is you'll actually want a mix of all of the above. So I don't know, let me scroll up maybe. So here's the web page that we are looking at, and what you might do is use a grid layout for the outermost shell. So you might use a grid layout to position the header and the left nav and the main content, and all the way at the bottom there's a footer somewhere, and maybe optionally you have a right sidebar as well. And grid layout is a really helpful tool for that, because you're laying out your elements in 2 dimensions. Great. But then you get to the header, and this is just a row of elements, and so maybe you actually use Flexbox here. So you'll have grid for the outermost, and then Flexbox inside of that grid, inside of one particular child element, which itself is a parent element. So maybe use Flexbox to create your heading, your nav bar. And then maybe once you get inside of the content, like maybe, I don't know if I have a good example of this, but no, I don't. Maybe there's images and stuff, and maybe some of those images use float left or float right so that they appear kind of next to some of the text. So you're not just using one layout tool and just using that for every single thing. You are using a mix generally, and you're usually nesting them so that it's, one layout inside of another layout inside of another layout. And the way I like to think about it is, I don't know, kind of think about it in terms of these rectangles, basically. So like I have one outermost rectangle, and that will use one layout, in this case maybe grid. And then once you have the basic layout of that outermost shell, then zoom in one level and say, okay, now I'm worried about this header. What layout should this header have? And maybe it's the same as the outermost one, but often it won't be. And just think about the header itself as the parent, and then focus on that, and keep going down the kind of hierarchy of nested elements until you get to something that is more obvious or whatever. So yeah, just think about your web page itself as like nested layouts, rather than I'm only going to use grid layout from now on because whatever. Generally, it's going to be a mix. Okay, I think this is the very last thing I want to talk about, and that is responsive design. So we've talked about different layout tools, and I briefly mentioned somewhere above like why we were talking about it. Again, maybe I should have actually talked about this at the beginning, but the whole goal of all of these layouts is to make sure that your content looks good, not just on your computer, but on everybody's computer. You have no control over whether your users have a 96-inch widescreen monitor or like an iPhone 5. Or somewhere in between. You don't know ahead of time what your users are going to be viewing your web page with, and that makes it really hard to create layouts. And the answer to that is something called responsive design. Some of these are a little buzzwordy, and I kind of get annoyed by them, but they are helpful in thinking about it. So here's a video, but let me just run through it real quick here. So I actually really like Twitter as an example of this. Let me go to like something neutral. So my monitor here has started out kind of skinny just because I decreased my resolution so that you can hopefully read the text in a smaller video. But let's do this. What I'm going to do is like resize my window. So you see how the layout works now. I'm going to make my window smaller and stuff changes. So the right nav has disappeared and the content still works. The tweets are still there. It's all good. I can make it much smaller and eventually it's as small as it's going to get, and it still works, and it still works fine. All of the basic functionality is there. So this is responsive design, where it kind of responds to the width of the window. Real quick, I'll also mention that it's also, for just to throw more buzzwords at you, this is like mobile first design, in that like here's what it would basically look like on a phone. And it works fine, right? This is mobile first because everything that you need to do, you can do. It's not like this weird, crappy experience where like half the stuff is broken. Everything that's here works great. And then the other thing that this is maybe an example of is progressive enhancement, where as I make my window wider, I get kind of bonus features. So I get this right sidebar here. Which you don't actually really need, but it's just kind of, the space is there. So Twitter is like, we might as well use it. So it's, progressive enhancement. It's progressively getting better as the window gets wider. Okay. So that is responsive design. That's just kind of explaining what it is, and mobile first design and progressive enhancement, all that. So there's the buzzwords. Now, how do you do that? Good question, viewer. The way you do that is generally through something called media queries, which is a CSS feature. Let me pop this out into its own thing. So in this case, the HTML is just a div that contains resize the window. You can think of this might be a div that is a grid layout, might be a div that's a Flexbox layout. Doesn't really matter. It's just a div. And by default, here's the CSS. It has a thin, solid black border, and it has a cyan, which is kind of a blue background. But it doesn't have a blue background. Why is that? That's because we are using a media query here. A media query is the @media keyword. Then I don't even remember what this thing's called, honestly. A media feature. Media type. Yeah, this is the media type. This can be screen, it can be print if you want to customize what your web page looks like after you print it out, like physically. You can change this to print to like change the layout and whatnot, maybe hide certain things. But whatever. For our purposes, this will generally be screen. Then the and keyword, and then this, which I think this is the media feature. Yeah. The media feature, which again, you don't have to memorize like the names for these things, but this is a property that triggers some different styling. And so looking at this kind of holistically, I say by default, my div has a blue background, cyan background. But if we are viewing it on the screen and we are at least 600 pixels wide, if the screen is at least 700 pixels wide, then change the background to lime, which is green. Let me maybe move this into its own window. Yeah. So I'm going to pop this out into its own window so I can play with it a little bit. So here's my window. Right now, let's actually go down to the default. So right now, I am looking at this CSS, which says, hey, content div, you have a blue background. And indeed it does. Cool. But if I resize it, when it becomes 700 pixels or wider, then it'll change to green. So I'm going to resize it. And there we go. Now it's green because that CSS media query is being triggered, and it's changing the styling of my web page. And so you can think in terms of, what's your default, which generally what you should do is design for like the smallest window that you support. And then as your screen gets wider, what changes. So like we saw on Twitter, maybe you pop up a right sidebar, maybe you change some font sizes, that kind of thing. So let's look at a slightly more complex example. Let me pop this open into its own thing. Oh, whoops, that's the old thing. I want this guy. So here's a web page, and let me make it small at first. So you can think of, again, like in terms of like mobile first development, I always think, what's it look like when it's as small as it's going to get. And you can see that my layout has just a kind of a column of content where I have a header, some content, a sidebar, which in this case is not actually a sidebar, but it's just kind of displayed as its own section, and then a footer. Now, as I get wider, as I increase the size of my window or of my screen here, you'll see that it kind of pops into a different layout that this wide screen, widescreen, I guess it's like 700 pixels here, whatever, this relatively wide screen supports. So, compare, here's what it looks like on a small screen. And then as I get more room, then I do a couple things. So you can kind of compare and contrast. And this is using media queries. So let me go to the actual code, just walk through that real quick. Okay, so the HTML has a container div, outermost div, and then some other divs. I don't know if I need to talk about them too carefully because they're just divs with some HTML content in them. Nothing too tricky going on there. And now in the CSS, what I say is, first of all, here's some default just to make it kind of look reasonable. And then I have a .container class, which is the outermost div. And I say, by default, you will use the Flexbox layout, display flex, and flex direction of column. So you're going to be a single column of content. And here's, an interesting thing that happens in the CSS. By default, the left sidebar has display none, which will hide it. It'll say, don't display the left sidebar by default. So if I go to the example, if I go here, so notice that in the smallest screen, which again, I encourage you to think of the smallest screen as the default, that's mobile first design, there's no left sidebar. It's not even, the right sidebar is not a right sidebar, but the content is there. The left sidebar is not visible by default. And you can think of that like maybe the left sidebar has just some other stuff that is not actually super critical to the experience of this web page. But as I increase the width of my window, now the left sidebar pops up. And the way that works is, again, by default, I say left sidebar, you have a display of none. But using this media query, when I get to a width that is at least 600 pixels, so when I increase the size of my window to be at least 600 pixels wide, then actually use display grid on my container and set up the columns. So I have 3 by 3. And then I set up some rules. So this is making the header span a few columns. So that's what makes it span all 3 columns. And then left sidebar display of block, which is telling the left sidebar to pop up to display itself. So basically anything other than none will cause it to display. By default it's block, so this is why it's block here. And the footer, kind of similar to the header, just kind of spanning the columns. So this is an example of the that holy grail layout, the most common layout on the internet these days. Going from this kind of mobile version, which contains all of the content in a column and no left sidebar, to this kind of standard widescreen display, which has the left sidebar and the right sidebar and all that good stuff. But what it comes down to is the media query here. Okay, so that's media queries. And we are down to the very last thing, which is your new best friend. Well, I think your new best friend is whatever search engine you use, because that's going to help you figure out the properties of both Flexbox and Grid. But a close second for your new best friend is a particular thing in your developer tools. So I'm just going to, this video is what I'm about to walk through, so whatever. Video in video, we are doing recursion. Anyway, hopefully by now you have played with your developer tools a little bit, and you can pop them up, developer tools, and hopefully you've seen at least the Elements tab. Eventually you'll use other things in here like your JavaScript console and your network tab, but at least hopefully you've used the Elements tab, maybe by like right-clicking and clicking inspect as well. It's another easy way to get here. But what I want to call your attention to is this button right here, this device toolbar button. And this is the most handy thing that you can use when you are developing your layout and you want to know like what it looks like on different screens. So chances are you don't have like in your immediate area a widescreen monitor and a phone and a laptop and a tablet and a different kind of phone and a different kind of monitor and whatever. Every kind of device on the planet is probably not within arm's reach. But that's okay, because you can use this tool to test out what your web page will look like on different devices. So I'm going to click it, and that pops open this kind of top, menu bar, where, long story short, you can pick different devices. So here's what Twitter looks like on an iPhone SE. And you can do the exact same thing on your own website and pop open this thing and see what your web page, what your layout will look like on various devices. So I don't know what it looks like on a Pixel 5, just a little wider, same kind of deal. But it's really handy for being able to test out different screen sizes, different device types without needing to actually load your web page on a physical device. This is a good first sanity check of any CSS you write. So anyway, I wanted to point this out because as you develop your layouts, you are very likely going to want to know what it looks like on different screen sizes. And yeah, you can always just resize the window of your browser, but that doesn't tell the full story. So this device toolbar tool is super handy. So I recommend checking this out and using this extensively when you are creating your layout. It's really handy. Okay, we have reached the end. This one ended up being a long video. I kind of knew it was going to be long going in. I'm hoping that the rest are not going to be that long, but the takeaways from this are thinking in terms of your CSS layout rules, your different options in terms of the history. So from tables to floats and blocks to Flexbox to grid, the reason these different options exist is because they solved different problems at different times in history. So as the language, as CSS has grown, we have additional tools in our toolbox, as we've learned about these various problems. That's not to say that the newest one is always better. It's more to say that these various tools are useful for different jobs. So grid is handy for laying things out in a 2D space. So maybe that's your outermost shell. Flexbox is useful for a single row or a single column of content. Floats and blocks are still used very commonly for internal layout, placing an image to the left or right of some text, for example. So you'll likely use all of these tools in your journey as a CSS developer. Then very briefly at a high level, Flexbox and grid work by using display flex or display grid, which tells a container to use the either Flexbox layout or grid layout instead of the default HTML layout rules. And then you set either Flexbox or grid properties on both the parent element or child element or children elements, child elements, whatever the plural of that is. And again, you do not have to know every single Flexbox property ahead of time. You don't have to memorize every single grid property. But most importantly, now that you know the fundamentals of setting properties, you can take those fundamentals and learn about new properties as you need them using your favorite search engine or pages like this one or pages like CSS Tricks or whatever. Then we talked about like the idea of nesting layouts where you're not just going to use just one, and then responsive design and mobile first design and media queries and all that good stuff. So these are all different tools that you can use to lay out your web page in CSS. Then at the very bottom, I just have a bunch of resources that you can check out. I will say that like I don't know how much I should highlight this, but like this old CSS, new CSS, this is the single best CSS tutorial I've ever read. This is the thing that made it click into place for me. I feel a little goofy like recommending it because it's very informal and like swears and stuff. So like I don't know if that stuff bothers you, maybe don't check it out. But if that doesn't bother you, I would recommend reading through that because it's a mix of really informative and also funny, but also just like it really helped contextualize like why does CSS have all these options. So that's like truly like that's the thing that made it click into place for me. And then I'm not going to go through everyone, but there's a bunch of different resources, and your favorite search engine is always your best friend. The last thing I'll call out is CSS Zen Garden is this kind of cool example of how powerful CSS can be. So the idea behind CSS Zen Garden is that there's this set of this HTML file. There's one HTML file, and the HTML file is the same. It's the exact same HTML, but each of these pages uses a different CSS file. So again, the HTML content is the exact same, but if I click around, the HTML content was the same. It still is the same, but it's so different just because the CSS has changed. So this is, it's a good example of how powerful CSS can be, how powerful CSS layouts can be. Again, same exact content, same exact HTML content. Nothing has changed in the HTML itself. The only thing that has changed is the CSS file. So I like this just as a demonstration of how powerful various CSS styling and layout and things can be. So check that out if you want some inspiration. Okay, I think I've reached the end and I've talked for way too long. So I appreciate your attention and for sticking with it. And as you have questions, please let me know. But that is CSS layout. So thanks for watching.